Awesome. So welcome to my session. My name is Clement Ho, and I'm going to talk about why should you contribute to open source, also known as open source software, OSS. So a little bit about me. My name is Clement Ho, as I mentioned earlier. I'm a front-end engineer at GitLab. On my off time, I'm really interested in faith and technology. My Twitter handle is ClemMakesApps, and I live in Austin, Texas. So for those of you who are not familiar with GitLab, GitLab is a software development lifecycle tool. So if you want to think about it, it's kind of like Trello plus GitHub plus Travis CI and a few more other tools. We have a Community Edition that's open source and Enterprise Edition that is built on top of Community Edition that is proprietary. So GitLab is kind of the way I got into open source. So I want to talk a little bit about my journey into open source software. Before GitLab, I worked at a Fortune 50 company. I really enjoyed it in the beginning, but after a few years, I was kind of ready to move on. This company viewed open source as kind of like free food in the buffet table, not realizing that there's a hidden cost of maintenance. Sometimes, I mean, you guys all know that software is not bug-free unless you're NASA. And so with open source, there are going to be bugs here and there, and you're going to have to invest time to fix them. And so the way that this company was going with this mindset was that we are only going to use open source that is super stable, aka they're really old, which is great for the most part, but you also miss out on a lot of developer tools and improve workflow. So this is kind of the framework and tools and that we have in front end in the last 7 years. It's not everything, but it's the most important ones. So in 2016 was about the time when I was trying to get out of that Fortune 50 company, trying to look at different jobs. And I realized that in a lot of these tools, I've either heard of them or have little to no experience with any of it. And this became more apparent when I was looking at jobs available in the market. If you're familiar with Hacker News, every month there's a who is hiring post that they automatically post, and people post job descriptions on there. And so you can see these, this is from 2016 of June, and all these new frameworks and tools are kind of the requirement. And so as I looked into this, I realized that if I wanted to get a new job, I had to catch up on these new technologies. So the question I had to wrestle was, how can I keep up with this latest technologies? So in that moment in time, I had to catch up, and I want to keep up with the latest technologies so that I don't end up in this cycle in the future when I'm looking for a new position. And with the momentum of open source, it's just going to keep growing. And so we need to have a good strategy for keeping up with these technologies. So to sum it all up, the lesson I learned during this time of my life is that if you don't keep up, you'll be left behind, and being left behind will stunt your career growth. And nobody here wants a stunt career growth. So what can we do to keep up? So one of the obvious ways to keep up, and what you guys are all doing here, is attending a conference like this one. This is actually from last year or something. I saw this on Twitter from 200OK. And so a conference like this is really great because we have organizers that curate kind of the speaker lists, the topics, so you can usually hear about what's most important, what's trending, upcoming topics. But there are some trade-offs. So talks, presentations, these conferences will generally require some kind of money. So whether it's just paying for the conference ticket or paying for traveling, there is a cost involved. And sometimes you may have to travel quite a bit to just get to these conferences. And they don't happen very frequently. Usually conferences happen on an annual basis. So you may ask, what about video recordings? There's a lot of YouTube videos, recordings of JSConf and other conferences. And I think they're really great ways to mitigate some of the trade-offs, but there are still some potential downfalls to these video recordings, such as it's mainly auditory learning. So people can talk as you as much as they want. Most of us are more kinesthetic learners. So auditory, we may not be able to receive as much. And because video recordings are typically not workshops, that's kind of, you generally hear a lot of information and it's hard to process that. So another way to keep up is to attend meetups. So I'm sure most of you guys at least have been a part of a meetup or at least checked one out. And I think they're really great because they're kind of like mini conferences. They take place maybe weekly or monthly, and it's really great for networking with your local community. But there are some trade-offs as well. Depending on where you live, it may not be available. So if you like to live on the beach and there's no developers in the beach, then you're not going to be able to do a meetup. You might be able to do a remote meetup. I haven't heard of that one. But generally speaking, meetups don't really scale around the world. It's more centered around hubs, cities that have a lot of developers. So another strategy of keeping up is to read books. So books are great. They cost money, sometimes more expensive, sometimes they're free. But it's also kind of difficult to ask follow-up questions for these kind of for this medium. So, for example, sometimes you read a book, you reach out to the author on Twitter, they respond. Sometimes they don't. But the good side of books is that usually they follow the current trend. Publishers don't really publish books that are irrelevant to the current trends, and so at least they are following that. But unfortunately, because of the time it takes to publish a book, to review a book, it can lag behind. And so that's kind of the trade-offs for books. So out of all the strategies I mentioned before, this is kind of one of my favorites, reading blogs. So I don't know if you guys tend to keep up with tech blogs, but I think that it's a really great way to keep up with the latest and greatest. Read them on Hacker News, whatever's posted there. This is great because reading blogs is asynchronous. So for me, I like to read it when I'm like waiting in line for the groceries. You can read a little bit and then catch up later. But similar to the way that watching YouTube conferences, this is more of visual learning versus auditory, and most of us are still kinesthetic learners. And so this may appeal to some of us, but not to all of us. And so those are kind of the trade-offs. So obviously, my talk is about open source, and I think that contributing to open source is the best way to keep up with these latest technologies, because open source is what's driving the momentum. So if you become a part of the momentum that is pushing these tools forward, you will generally learn about these things as they grow. So I've mentioned a little bit about kinesthetic learning. Contributing to open source is a great way to do kinesthetic learning, because as you contribute, whether it's code or docs, you get this feedback process. As you contribute, there's usually a maintainer or a reviewer that looks at the code, that kind of gives you feedback, that kind of says, hey, maybe you should think about it this way, you should architecture it this way. And this is a really good way to practice becoming a better developer or a better docs writer. I was talking with someone over here, and they were saying that in their current company, there's no one to mentor them. And this is a great way to get free mentorship. It doesn't cost you anything. The maintainers love contributors because they're getting some free work, and you get to learn from these experts. So it's a win-win situation. It's also location flexible. You can literally go anywhere in the world as long as there's internet, and you can contribute to open source. So you're not restricted. You can decide to live in the middle of the desert if that's where you want to be, and you can still stay engaged and keep up with these technologies. It's also really fun and rewarding. So this is a tweet that someone made in 2015 of their experience contributing for the first time. It's really fun because you get to contribute to something bigger than yourself. And usually whenever you contribute, these projects impact a lot more people than, let's say, your little side projects. So it's really fun to be able to do that. Another great reason why contributing to open source is great is building reputation. So as you contribute regularly to projects, people will start to notice. People will start referring to you as their questions. You become an expert, and through that, you're able to grow as a developer and network with other developers. So at GitLab, we actually also have an MVP award that we give every month, every release, to recognize valuable contributors. And I think this is a really great way to also build reputation. So I'm not really sure if other projects do this, but I think this is a great way for other open source to recognize contributors. So contributing can also get you a job, like it did for me. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. As you build a reputation, The people that work with the project are going to want to hire you so you can do it full time. So here is a list of the top 10 most open source contributors by organizations, and 8 out of the 10 in this list are actually hiring. So as you become a regular contributor, you kind of get a feel for the work environment. You get to collaborate with these people that work in these companies. So it's kind of getting like an internship without saying the word internship. And as you build a reputation, you can also get an easy introduction to a recruiter in those companies. And in my personal opinion, I think that as you contribute to these projects, your interview process is actually easier than if you weren't exposed to this. So I've already talked about the benefits of why each of you guys should contribute to open source, but what would the impact be for the larger community as a whole? So this is kind of dreaming a little bit, but if all of us contributed to open source, a lot of developer tools will continue to become better and improve developer happiness. And I don't know if you guys have seen this, especially with the front end, but developer tools such as Babel and Webpack have really accelerated the growth of projects and speed, and it's also made development more enjoyable. So if everyone contributed, we can actually increase this momentum, which sounds really crazy because it's already going so fast, but this is a good thing. And we can actually also continue to improve the programming language. So what I mean by that is, if you're not aware of Babel, so if you guys, can I get a raise of hands who doesn't know what Babel is, or who has heard of Babel? Okay, cool, that's good. So I don't have to explain it. But Babel is already working with TC39, which is the team that actually does the JavaScript spec, and they're actually working with them to kind of test and improve stage 0 specs. So what that means for you guys who are not aware is that JavaScript has a team that kind of determines what the specs should be, and they send it to the browsers. And people can actually propose certain things to be implemented in the language. And so it goes from stage 0 to stage 3, I think. And so there's different stages, and during the proposals, they actually write out what it should look like. And Babel actually lets you transpile the code and run it before it's actually implemented in the browser. And by doing that and working with TC39, they can actually test whether certain specs are actually good specs, spec proposals, so that they can actually implement it in a timely manner and more efficient, more beneficial to the community. But that's really just the tip of the iceberg. If everyone contributes to open source, we can actually lead to a lot less maintainer burnout. So most people don't realize, but it takes a lot of effort to maintain an open source software. And most of these projects die when the maintainers burn out. A lot of projects have 1 or 2 maintainers, and then when they get sick or something, it kind of dies down a little bit. So if everyone contributes to open source, maintainers can actually take a break because the community can fill the spot. And similar to the way you guys would want to have work-life balance at work, maintainers want work-life balance too. And so you guys can be a part of the solution. And so with that in mind, if everyone contributed, projects will actually last longer and be more robust in the long run. So this is Babel's Open Collective page. You guys might have heard of Open Collective. It's a really great resource for donating money. It's kind of like Patreon or a Kickstarter for open source projects. A lot of times when we think of how can we best support open source projects, we think, let's just give them money, which I agree, money is important, but it's actually not the best way to support them. So Henry Drew, which is one of the maintainers of Babel, he actually tweeted out and said that he would rather have people contribute to projects, contribute to Babel, than to give them money because of the benefits I mentioned earlier. So how do we get started? You may be at least convinced or at least intrigued by the idea of contributing at this point. So let's talk about how to get started. So when we think about contributing to open source, a lot of times we think about that's just writing code, but it's a lot more than that. There's kind of 3 primary ways to contribute to open source: triaging issues, writing docs, and writing code. A lot of times we say writing code as the blanket statement, sometimes just to make it easier, but I don't think it's a good way forward. So let me show you some online resources that you guys can use to do your first pull request. So your first PR .github.io is a really great first resource. It kind of shows you on their website what they do, but basically they just highlight simple issues that you can use to get started. They also have a Twitter page, a Twitter handle that you can follow and set up notifications. So whenever they retweet something, someone asking for help for an easy issue, you can easily follow up and work on that. And if Twitter's not your medium, they also have a GitHub repository where they cross-reference issues, so you can take a look at those as well. Another resource is First Timers Only. First Timers Only is similar to the other one, my first PR, but this one is focused on actually having specific labels for projects that highlight great candidates for first pull requests. So they actually cross-reference a few other resources as well, but they encourage open source projects to create labels called First Timers Only so that you can easily search for low-hanging fruit, easy issues that you can work on as your first contribution to open source. So another resource, this is sort of a resource. This is actually an annual event called Hacktoberfest that's hosted by DigitalOcean and GitHub. And what they do is they're trying to encourage more contributors to open source. What they do is for the month of October, if you contribute at least 4 pull requests, you can get a free t-shirt. So this is a great way to contribute to open source and also get some awesome swag. So for first timers, here are some of my tips that I would give for you guys. Ideally, you want to find projects that have active maintainers. So ideally, you want to have active maintainers so that your code gets reviewed and merged within a couple days. I've had experiences myself where I submitted a pull request and then I forgot about it, and then 1 year later I heard that it got merged. So that is not a really great first experience that you want to have. So you want to find projects with active maintainers so that you can have those benefits of reviewing and learning from other people. You also want to find projects with low-hanging fruits. So by that I mean you want to find projects that have easy, simple fixes where it's really obvious. Maybe it's some CSS issue or remove a console log. Those kind of issues are great because you can easily submit a pull request. The reviewer easily can tell that this is going to fix the problem, and it will get merged a lot faster. As you continue to contribute, then I say that you should continue for larger issues. But to start off, simple issues are better because it's easier to get reviewed and merged quicker. Another tip is find projects with easy contribution steps. So some projects requires CLAs, which is kind of agreement that you sign saying that you release your code to them, which is great for some people. But as a first timer, I would recommend not doing those kind of projects because it just adds extra overhead for your first pull request. And sometimes you might have to get approval from your manager at your work to sign off on this thing, and it just takes forever. So I wouldn't recommend that as your first one. So let's go through some example projects that we can go through together and learn about how to make these observations of good projects to contribute to. So this is an example, Insomnia. This is one of the good ways to actually check if a project is healthy for you to contribute to. This is a GitHub view for the repository. You actually click on Insights and click on Pulse. And this is kind of the activity, the health of the project. I actually filtered these by last month, so you can kind of have a bigger view perspective of how they're doing in the last month. So this is an example of a pretty active project. There's about 30 pull requests in the last month, so about 1 a day. But there's something to be careful of is that there seems to only be 1 active maintainer. So in the bottom graph, it's one really tall one and everyone else is really short. So this is kind of a potential concern. You can still contribute to a project like this, but it seems like this project is very reliant on that 1 maintainer, and if he gets sick or he decides to quit this project, then this project is kind of up in the air. This is an example of a really healthy project. They have about 200 pull requests in the last month, and they have a few more regular maintainers, about 4 or 5 in the chart. And so this is a good example where if one person decides to quit or he gets sick, this project will still keep going. This is an example of a project you do not want to contribute to. So in the last month, there's only 2 pull requests, 2 commits by 2 different people. So this is a project that seems to be more in the maintenance mode because of all the issues that they've closed. So I would definitely strongly recommend not contributing to a project like this. So another tip that I have for you guys is that docs always need love. And so by that, I mean docs are usually underappreciated, but as a first timer, they're actually a great way to get started into contributing because it can actually get you familiarized with the code as opposed to having to figure it out all by yourself. So you should use that to your advantage. So this is a quote from a contributor from one of the open source projects. He's actually saying that he's working on trying to improve docs because that actually enables everybody to contribute to their project easily, which sounds like a no-brainer, but docs are usually what we think of as lesser than code. So take this quote as another evidence of why contributing to docs is great. So this is actually a graph from a report that GitHub recently posted about the problems encountered in open source. And a lot of reasons why people don't contribute is because of the incomplete or confusing documentation. And so as you actually help the documentation, you're actually making the project more healthy, which attracts more contributors, which makes the project last a lot longer. And what's really interesting about this report, you can check it out at opensourcesurvey.org, is that they're actually saying that this is the reason the docs not being up to date is actually leading to gender inequality for contributing to open source. Men are actually more likely to contribute to projects that have bad docs than women are. And so actually, if we all can help docs, we can actually help that situation as well. So another tip I would give you is that you don't have to know everything before contributing. So there's a myth that you have to know everything before you contribute, and that's just simply not true. So as I mentioned Henry Ju earlier, the maintainer of Babel, he actually didn't know the entire code base when he started contributing, and now he's a maintainer. And for me personally, I'm a maintainer of GitLab's front end, and I don't even know the entire code base. So don't feel like you have to know everything. Obviously know a little bit of what you're touching, but you don't have to feel like you have to master everything. So let's go through an example together. Let's actually start practicing. Let's do our first pull request together. So what better project to contribute to than the 200OK website? If you guys didn't know 200OK website, the conference website is actually hosted on GitHub Pages, and it's hosted on this link. So we're actually going to go through an example of what it's like to contribute. So I'm going to do some live coding. I'm going to change it to mirroring. All right. Cool. So I'm going to first open the repository. So here, let's take a look at the issues. Usually issues is a great way to look for stuff that needs work on the website. You can also check out the website and kind of see what needs work, but low-hanging fruit is usually issues that are already created. So out of all these, this seems like a very easy issue to get started on, adding social sharing links. So let's go through that as an example. So first, you would want to fork this project, which will basically create the repository on your own account because I don't have permissions for the actual repository. And then we will want to clone the repository. So usually while it's cloning, you would want to actually take a look at the README README is a great way to get started. If the README wasn't there, then that would be my first contribution to help the README get better. So it looks like to install, we clone it, and then we cd into it, and when we install dependencies using npm install. So let's wait for a little bit. While it's reloading, let's keep going. So it looks like there's some information about file structure, which seems great for adding new pages, but doesn't seem like it would help us in editing the page, because we'll have to figure out which page we want to edit. So it's kind of slow. But for now, let's go actually take a look at the actual website to kind of visualize what we can actually improve. So here we have the header, the hero. So I think a good place to put these social icons would be right under this watch live stream, so that people can tweet about it or talk about it on Facebook. So that's kind of what I was thinking. Let's see. All right, so now it's cloned. So let me cd into it like the instructions said, and then npm install. Cool. So while it's doing that, let's continue reading the README. So it says to actually run this locally, all I have to do is run this command. So that's really simple. Sounds great. We'll just have to run it once this installs the dependencies. I'm gonna, hold on. Actually open the code on a different tab while the dependencies are installing. Oh, it's really small. Okay, well, what I usually do when I'm contributing code and I'm not really sure, one way you can do is to actually look through all the files and try to figure out where you're gonna add that file. But for me, I think the easiest way is to kind of figure out where that specific element is at. So we can actually go here and let's see, watch live stream seems like a good text to kind of search for. So maybe that'll show us which page that's on. So I'm going to do a global search on Sublime Text. Well, this one looks like the menu though, so that doesn't seem right. Might actually not be, this might not actually be on master, I think. But let's search for June 2nd. That seems like another thing that's worth searching for. Cool. So this is layout.index. That seems a lot more correct. And so here it actually says buy tickets now instead of watch live stream, but it's okay. So we can actually test out what I'm thinking, my assumptions. So let's run the actual serve command that we found in the docs. Allow. Okay, so this will run it locally, like what the docs told me. So cool. It says buy tickets now. So let's just add the social media buttons underneath that. So here, buy tickets now. So let's go ahead and write some code. So I'm going to go ahead and just add a href. And I need to figure out what the URL is. So I actually need to go back to the issue. And then I'm going to use the same classes that is used for the buy tickets now button. Cool. And then I saved it. And so let's try to refresh it and see if it fixed it or added it. Cool. So now we have the Facebook, Twitter buttons. So now we know for sure that this is the right place. So let's actually make it an icon because that's kind of hideous looking. Um, so I'm not really sure. Well, I actually do know this project, but if you didn't know and you want to see if there's font awesome, you can easily just search. Oh, look, there's font awesome in this project. So let's use that. And then adding an ARIA label for accessibility. Don't forget that. Cool. And then I refresh the page. It looks good, but the blue padding still looks kind of ugly. So let's remove that. Cool. So that looks pretty good to me. So I'm gonna actually commit this code. So if you're not familiar with how Git works, you generally want to do features in branches so that they're more isolated. You don't want to actually push straight to master. So I'm actually going to create a branch that says add social icons. So it seems like when I did npm installed, I actually upgraded a package. Since it's not really relevant, I'm going to not add that. And then I'm going to push this to GitHub. Great. So now this is on my GitHub. We can actually refresh it. Actually, it auto refreshes. So now it sees that I made a pull request or push my code, push my branch up. So now let's create the pull request. Oh, not the dictionary. So here it says I'm going to do a pull request from my repository, my branch add social icons to Techlahoma 200 OK sites master. So let me add a comment. So I know that Luke is in charge of this, so I'm gonna at him and say, please review this code that was contributed by the audience. So once I create the pull requests, it is now on the 200 OK repository, and so now we've officially worked together on creating our first pull request together. So now we have all contributed to open source together. So it's very simple. And with that, I just want to say thank you. Feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or on GitLab with Clement Apps is my handle. I'm also a front-end coach on GitLab, so if you ever need help, feel free to reach out. Also want to thank the organizers for putting together an awesome conference, and also for my wife for coming here and supporting me. Any questions? No questions? One question. One in the back.
Do you have general tips for people to convince their organizations to put?
Yeah, so I'll repeat the question. So the question was, do you have any tips for how to convince your organization to contribute to open source? I think that I think it's a good general idea, assumption to say that all companies at this point use at least some kind of open source. So I would say the tip is to have that conversation with your management and just kind of explain that you need to at least contribute at some point, because not all software is bug free, and you're bound to find bugs. And as you contribute, you actually get familiarized with these tools that you already use, and that can actually save development time in the long run. So So that's kind of what I would say.
One observation I would have is, like, I totally agree with like contributing to get mentors and meet the people that you want to work with and like learn things. Because I started out writing docs for like 3JS, and I got to meet all the people like doing all the stuff with it, and I've met tons of people and learned a ton. Because like the more I gave back to the community, the more they gave to me. So like just for confirming like what Clement has said, like that is definitely my story for sure.
Any more questions?
What kind of work did you do on GitLab before they hired you on?
Yeah. So GitLab is actually, since it's open source, you can actually look up what I've done. So I started off contributing about 2 months before they hired me. So I kind of spent like a couple hours a day just contributing low-hanging fruit. There are some things I want to fix that are more JavaScript focused, and those tend to take longer to review because it could have potential side effects, and you also have to write tests for it. I did a lot of CSS fixes because those are very simple to get reviewed. Usually, the reviewer just looks at it real quick, checks it out, looks good, and then they merge it. So a lot of small bugs I fixed at GitLab. Cool. Thanks.